Friends, today we will study OSIV, Open Session in View. This is the property provided by Spring Data JPA. We will look at what is OSIV, how shall we use it, what will be its effect on the application if it is marked true, if it is marked false. OSIV basically provides a transactional pattern to the request. It helps to bind the persistent session and the request lifecycle together. Though it provides great benefits, but it can result in serious performance issues in production. Let's take a look at working of OSIV first. Whenever a request, an HTTP request, lands into the application, Hibernate's session is bound to the request via Spring in one of its interceptor classes. These sessions are not necessarily connected to the database. It's just the transactional session which is bound to the request. Every time the application would need a transactional session with the database, it will reutilize the same which was initially bound. And at the end of the request, this session will then be returned back to the pool by the same interceptor class. So if we understand this in depth, whenever a request lands to the application, a connection to the DB is bound to that particular request. This connection is not open initially, but will get open at the first contact of the database. Meaning, initially the connection is not open. However, if there is any contact made with the database, the connection would get open. And it would remain open until the request terminates. Once the request completes, this particular connection will then be returned back to the pool. So if we try to visualize this, a particular user is sending a request to the application would request for the database session which will be bind to the request. Any point in time, this particular request will then need to contact the database. It will reutilize the same connection which is marked in blue over here. Once the request completes, this connection will then be returned to the application pool, the database connection pool. So by this, if we closely examine here, we can maximum serve a TPS of 5 over here because we have 5 connections marked. So now the time is for practical. Let's visualize this. So I have made a simple Spring Boot application utilizing Spring Data JPA. Open session is view. This is the property which controls the behavior of OSIV. Its default value is true. Here we have not provided the value, so by default it will be taking a value true. Let me just start the context. This is a basic application utilizing Postgres database. So the application is started. Is enabled by default. As we can see, JPA based configuration class prints a log. Open session in view is enabled by default. So these will be performed view rendering. Database queries can be performed during view rendering. Right? I'll just clear the logs and via terminal we will try to hit this particular API. As we can see, we have received this request and initially we have 5 total connections. Of 5, there is none marked active currently. So the thread here is sleeping in order to mark any third-party API integration or any computation that could be possible into the API. When we tried to access the database initially, it initiated the transaction, committed the JPA transaction, but did not close the JPA entity manager after the transaction. We have obtained the data which was required to be fetched from the database. And again, a thread.sleep indicates that there could be any third-party API call or maybe some heavy computation. Once the request has terminated, as we can see over here, the connection has been closed. Right? Now, had this property been false, which we can mark it over here right now, and we will restart the context again, the connection would have been available right after the database contact. That means once the transaction is over, the connection is returned back to the pool. And this is what we're going to see in the video right now. The context has started and we are reheating the same API. As we can see, we have received the request over here. A sleep here again indicates the same behavior. Maybe any third-party API call, any heavy computation. Here again we can see there is a connection pool of 5 threads and none is marked active over here. We created a new connection, a new transaction, sorry. We opened the entity manager, initiated the transaction, committed the transaction and closed the entity manager, which is in contrast with the previous behavior where the thread did not close the transaction. It did not return the pool. It did not return the thread to the pool. And as we can see, the request has been completed. However, the connection was marked closed long before. So how can we now achieve this behavior? By just marking this false, will that help? No, this will never help. Reason being, quite possible we are using lazy loadings into our application, and this behavior will actually break all the lazy loadings which have been utilized in the application before. So just switching off this property can result into different production issues and is never recommended. The second approach, however, can definitely help to avoid this. There are two ways to fix this. First is to mark this property as false and rework the entire application, re-architecture the entire application for any kind of lazy loading behavior or anything that was bound to break because of this property. The second approach, however, is to leave the property as is and override this open entity manager in view interceptor. This is the class which Spring AutoWires creates a bean for when open in view property is marked true. What we have done over here is, in this particular class, we have skipped few URIs which are based out of this particular list. So here, test v4 user 1 is basically an API which has been bypassed for the transaction binding initially. How this is going to work is what we are going to see next. Currently the property is at its default behavior. We are reinitializing the context now. in this particular API, we have obtained the data from the database, did some kind of a computation represented by thread.sleep at line number 33, saved the data back to the database, did some computation or maybe third-party API calling again, and then completed the request. I'll just clear the logs and make a hit to v4 version of the same API. As we can see over here, we have received the request for v4. Initially the connections are 5 again, but active has been marked as 0. The property behavior is currently true. However, we have skipped the transaction binding with the request. So as we can see, our first database contact creates a new transaction since it did not get one. It found the entity, it committed the transaction and closed the transaction. So the thread has been returned back to the pool. Currently the thread is running at line number 33. Now again, we created a new transaction, updated the required resource at the database and closed the transaction. Again, we are doing some processing at line number 35. And now the request is completed successfully. So with this, we understand that we have achieved OSIV false behavior. However, when the property was marked true. So this is basically a short example how to skip certain URLs which are bound to create some serious production issues, and we don't have to rework our entire application. So that's it for this video, guys. We'll get back. In case you like the content, you find it knowledgeable, do share the content, do comment in case it can be further improvised.